Hello and welcome to the Deep State Consciousness Podcast. Today I'm joined by Martin Wells. Martin is a psychotherapist who works in the NHS, the National Health Service in Britain, and he also has an interest in non-duality and incorporates that into his work. So Martin, good morning.
Good morning.
So I think before we get into any of that, I'm going to have to ask you to give something of a definition of non-duality.
Okay.
In a way that's perhaps accessible to people who are more interested in the therapeutic aspect and have tuned into this.
Yes. No, absolutely. It's a weird thing to define in a way, isn't it? Because we're talking about something, a not something, which is a bit unusual when we're defining anything, really. But of course, we can't talk about oneness because that's in effect what we are. But linguistically, it's not possible to talk about oneness in a way that the mind can absorb. So we then need to talk about not something, not two. And the relevance for therapy in that is that we take ourselves to be a number of things. Like in the NHS, for example, people take themselves to be their diagnosis, for example, or their personality adaptations, or their defensive mechanisms, or their attachment styles. Now, all of that, in a sense, is ultimately not who we are. So the relevance of non-duality, not this and not that, in psychotherapy is that we can strip away all the things that we've imagined ourselves to be, including some fairly problematic stuff for people, including a sense of being a bad person or a failure or not lovable. You know, these are fairly extreme fictions that people carry in their minds about themselves, and they feel very real.
Yeah.
So the relevance then of non-duality is that we're inviting people to deeply question that. Is that true? Am I that? I know I've believed that and I've lived that out. It's become a self-fulfilling prophecy, but ultimately, is it true?
Yeah, and that's my big interest in these interviews, really, because I'm very aware that people live in a prison of their own minds for a lot of their lives, and they might be aware that what they know is kind of fictional in terms of their thoughts about them being a bad person, but it doesn't, on some level, change the fact that they think it. So I'd like to just pause there and pick up on that theme in a moment, but just go back in time to ask a question I find I ask a lot of people on these interviews is, how did this start for you? Were you a therapist who became interested in the meditative non-dual, or were you a non-dualist who got into therapy? What's your story?
No, it's more the other way around. I started my professional life as a social worker, in my early 20s, and at that time was already interested in Eastern mysticism, Eastern philosophy. And I had, at that stage, was not putting the two together at all, but just they were both really strong interests of mine. And then I studied in psychotherapy and came across someone who was teaching meditation and integrating that into psychotherapy. So the two came together. Although that wasn't non-duality, that was more of a progressive path of meditation. And then about 10 years ago, I attended a conference at the Royal College of Psychiatrists where a French psychiatrist was speaking, and he'd studied with Jean Klein, and he spoke in a way that just enabled me to really understand non-duality at a very deep level. In a way, everything changed in that experience. And everything changed in terms of my approach to therapy, my approach to my own psyche and my own story. So it was a radical letting go of a way of thinking about the human mind and body that I'd carried for years, really.
So you directly experienced the kind of transformational shift you might be talking to clients about.
Yes, exactly, and that had a ripple effect that lasted for years in terms of undermining all sorts of ways that I had thought about relationships and about the psyche, about myself and the world.
Undermining thoughts you'd picked up from therapy, or thoughts?
Yes, therapy and my own personal story, but also the story of therapy, the cultural story of therapy, stories of progress and change and, you know, improvement. All those sort of notions fell away in a sense.
So how do non-duality and therapy fit together? Is it a marriage made in heaven, or is it a bit of an awkward relationship sometimes?
Yeah, no, good question. I think in a way it's all a marriage made in heaven. So in a sense we're sort of looking for false distinctions if ever we separate these things up. But I think there are some problems with a therapy that takes things to be too real, to the story to be too real, and has notions of change or healing when actually fundamentally, philosophically in non-duality, there's nothing to change. There's nothing wrong. So a notion where we're trying to fix something, and of course in the NHS that's part of the paradigm, in a sense, that people come to hospitals and doctors and nurses for treatment. So it challenges the paradigm. Absolutely.
So that struck me as a real paradox, probably in my early 20s, where I'd been very invested in non-duality, and my mental well-being had declined. I'd fallen into a kind of a depression. Really, the non-duality had played a role in that, from going into myself. And as my beliefs about what was in there and finding infinite divine love fell away and the reality hit home, I just kind of feel this blackness, this emptiness.
Yes.
And there was a paradox then of like very much wanting things to be different, but finding a lot of relief in accepting them as they are. So I felt what was really protective of me in that was I could step out of my story and say, how horrendous it is. It's also this amazing drama that's playing out, and I'm loving being a part of it. It's great. And that was fantastic. But then the thought came up, well, should I want to change it? Because a part of me wants to change. I don't want to live like this forever. And it seemed like a paradox, which I feel I found some reconciliation in, with the non-changing, the being with, as opposed to the desire to shift, was the thing that enacted change, paradoxically. How do you find you reconcile with that yourself?
I think that's absolutely true, and I've heard that from a number of people, and I've heard that in myself. And of course, in the Zen tradition, for example, it is built around paradox. You know, the koans that actually are designed to stop the mind with its sort of binary attempts to say that it's this or that, or I should change from this to that. And I think the acceptance of that paradox for all of us, because we'll each have a version of that, I think, as well as a cultural version of that, is a profound step to take. And as you say, absolutely, there's a paradox in that something radically changes without us attempting to change it. So
sorry, go ahead.
No, go on. You go.
I was going to. Is this a problem then in therapy without that non-dual perspective? Because I imagine, especially if you work for an organisation like the NHS, that when you have a target to essentially change someone, I can imagine that could be a very frustrating experience.
Yes.
So, do you feel it's a problem to attempt to engage in a therapeutic process without that knowledge of this on the deeper level of being, say, everything's okay, and that's going to cause? Or do therapists find something similar in a different way, maybe not in the language of non-duality?
I think they do. And you've got people like Ellis who wrote about unconditional positive regard. You know, and the only problem, as I see it, is that we profoundly underestimate our presence and our accepting presence as a healing energy, in a sense. So I think there's a lot of things spoken about therapy working in this way and that way, as though it's the technique, or as though it's some sophisticated intervention. And actually, probably, if you distilled it down, it would be some sort of loving acceptance, some sort of openness to the other, some sort of deep listening that comes from the other. And in terms of oneness, because I do a fair amount of supervision as well, then what we see time and time again is that the right person comes to the right therapist. Not because that therapist is fixed in any way, but because they, in their own hearts, are wrestling and struggling with similar sorts of issues. So in a way, you then have two seekers in the room, each in a sense inquiring into the true nature of themselves. And that's in itself an amazing experience for the patient and the therapist.
And is it common in therapy to view things that way, or is there a sense, like, I mean, what I get from the sense of, like, Freud, say, is the therapist the authority figure?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And what you're suggesting there is quite contrasting to that. You've got two people on a similar journey, with one in a slightly more guiding role. So is that something therapists have to wrestle with also?
I think so. And it's changing, and it's changing quite radically, really. So the newer therapies, sort of mentalization-based therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, and mindfulness, very significant part of NHS work these days. In a way, they're quite different in terms of authority. So people are much more into the patient as a resource, the patient as someone, again, where there's fundamentally nothing wrong, but where attachment styles have interrupted their true being, their capacity to love and be intimate. So I think those are really changing the nature of therapy within the NHS.
Could you perhaps give an example of what it's like for you as the therapist in a room, the difference you feel it makes opening up to that sense of non-dual accepting awareness, and the acceptance that you're perhaps in some symbolic sense looking into a mirror with the person, and how that changes the therapeutic interaction from, say, what might have gone on in the past?
Yes. I was thinking of an example more from supervision of a colleague of mine who, very competent person, consultant, very sort of well respected, and she came against a brick wall. So she was on her way to work, and she just couldn't go any further. She'd been harassed and stalked by a particular family who had made her life very, very difficult, in a sense. And she's a psychiatrist, so she considered formal therapy, she considered medication, she considered all sorts of things. I think she even thought about admission at one stage. She knew she was in the middle of a breakdown. But she chose to come and talk to me about it. And it was what she wrote about afterwards, I think, that was quite telling. That she said that she looked into my eyes and there was no fear. So wow. I think what was somehow able to convey was, embrace this. There's nothing going wrong here. There's something emerging from your history that needs to be cleared and needs to be opened up. And she learned a huge amount about vulnerability, about asking for help, and about her true perfection. Without trying to be perfect, there was a perfection in all that was happening, in a sense. So I suppose, in the answer to your question, that it's a stance that we take up, and it's not even a stance that we take up. It's it's an immersion in the perfection of nature unfolding. So then the words that come from the therapist's mouth are in a sense an encouragement to embrace whatever comes.
I think that resonates with a common theme I found interviewing therapists of different perspectives on this podcast. Of they have a client who's afraid or ashamed of what's within them.
Yes.
And the therapist provides a space where they're not shaming the person. They don't think it's bad. And more than that, they're not afraid. If it's something dark or malevolent feeling or evil feeling within, they can provide a space that says, look, it's okay. It's okay to look at this. It's not something that's going to overwhelm and destroy you. We're looking at this, and that's going to provide, there's not that fear in the psyche of the therapist. There's a willingness to meet that. That's a common theme.
Yes. And I think it's absolutely that. And I think what can then happen is if that's understood and embraced by the client or the patient, then there's a sense of creativity rather than failure. There's not something going wrong here. I'm not falling apart and I'm never going to put it together again. I'm engaged in a creative process that actually I'm participating in. On a subtle, unconscious level.
And that's a massive shift, because you can't guarantee that everyone's going to transcend all of their issues in a few sessions of anything.
No.
You can change the way you look at that, from rather than this awful thing that's being done to me from some what almost feels like an outside source to I'm involved in this exciting kind of hero's journey, to use that Joseph Campbell term. My own hero's journey I'm battling, and it does have all the angels and demons you find in mythology and fantasy in my own mind. Out, and that's a total shift then.
Yes, absolutely. And it means revisiting. I mean, there's no bypass. It's not a sort of new age transcendence in that sense. It's an absolutely facing the original trauma and the original story, and a letting go.
Because the hero's journey is always encompassing that darkness and requires us to face our shadow in whatever form that takes.
Exactly that. Yeah.
So what is the to switch over from your perspective as the therapist delivering this then to how the client might engage themselves with non-duality? So the first thing I imagine is you've got that word to get over, non-duality. You might not be familiar. So what is it like for the client to access that sense of consciousness within themselves, and how you might guide them into that in whatever way they can come to it?
Well, I think what Jean-Marc, the French guy, often spoke to me about was that there are two strands to that, two streams to that, really. So there's the understanding, and there's the practice. So one without the other, in a sense, is very partial. So it's important that we understand what we're talking about in non-duality. I don't always use that term, but I might use other metaphors, or I might talk about ego and the function of ego, and or the mind, and how like in a classic mindfulness, we might just observe these things. So not me, not that. Someone might be very caught in their thoughts. So the work might be to really help them challenge those thoughts, sometimes quite vigorously. It's not just a sort of passive waiting, but a sort of tough love. Come on, is that true? Is that really true? And then for themselves to practice that, and perhaps partly in the session, but I often see people only once every 3 or 4 weeks these days. So I'm not in regular weekly contact with people. But then their practice is engage in a self-inquiry. It's notice in relationships what's ego, what comes from beyond ego. Can you make a discernment between the story and the story-less being, free from that? So there's a practice.
to link back to sort of where you began, then people are being encouraged to allow those maybe slightly deeper unconscious thoughts that are driving behavior,
Yes.
but they're not fully aware of, the I'm
Yes.
worthless, I'm a bad person thoughts to come, and then by
Yes.
bringing awareness to them, shining that light on them and challenging them, going deeper and say, okay, but is that truly who I am? Who am I?
Yes.
Coming back to
Yes.
that fundamental who am I?
Yes, exactly.
Can you perhaps describe what kind of shifts you see occurring in people when they're able to? And the reason I ask is because I feel that I encounter people who are aware that their thoughts about themselves are wrong, that they're
Yes.
not ugly, worthless, blah, 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 whatever it is, but
Yes.
they're still a prisoner to those thoughts.
Yes.
And the years can go by and they remain prisoners, and they feel like it's a cage on all sides and there's no getting out. So
Yes.
yeah, that's why I'd like to ask you, what do you see occurring when people question the I that is in the cage?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the most we can do is invite people into that space. And I years ago we had a Chinese Buddhist nun work in the psychiatric hospital where I am, and she would turn up with all her robes, and she would run a sort of relaxation meditation group. And I said to her, how would you describe what you're doing? And she said, well, I sit in my stillness and I invite people into theirs. So these were the two things that she said, really. And I think all we can do is just as she described. So as a therapist, I think it's my job to sit in my stillness, so be as present and as open and as lacking in story and ego as I can, so that what comes from a stillness, and that can only invite, in a sense. So it invites the other person to know that stillness in themselves, and as you're saying, not just know it theoretically, like the difference between the observer and the thought, but to know it. Okay, there it is, in a sense. And some people get that. Some people get it quickly. Some people get it slowly. Some people don't get it. And there's nothing that we can do about that other than really be a guide to that via our own presence and stillness. There's the invitation.
Thank you, Martin. I'd just like to ask one more question. Actually,
Sure.
you mentioned about the NHS and things seem to be going in the direction of mindfulness, and it's positive. So I'd just like to ask you a little bit more about that. I mean, do you think things are going in the right direction? And are there any ways where you feel things might be going off course with the integration of mindfulness? Is it being changed in any way? And do you see problems arising with, you mentioned the kind of new age, I think new age was the term you used, spiritual bypassing. And when you open the door to non-duality, all sorts of things might come pouring through, like Reiki, crystal, chakra healing. And is there anything wrong with them? I'm sure I've been involved in all at one point or other.
Me too.
Yeah, so great. So, but does it open up all sorts of challenges? Just a whatever general sense you have of that whole mumble of the question there.
Yeah. Have you heard of Mark Williams?
I don't think I have, no.
He's a professor of psychology in Oxford, and he did some fairly seminal research on mindfulness that was a sort of gold standard research within the NHS.
Okay, yeah.
And it was accepted then, which meant basically that within the NICE guidelines in the NHS, people could teach mindfulness as an accepted way of helping with depression, for example, depression and anxiety. And he was asked, he was interviewed on Radio 4 program about mindfulness. And the interviewer said, well, you know, there's problems with there's mindfulness now in the corporate world, in the army, in the House of Commons, et cetera, et cetera. And she said, are you worried about this? Is it diluting, distorting something? And he said, no, it's inherently subversive. Right. It's inherently subversive. Right. So if we sit and really be with the observer in us and the witness, then the stuff will fall away. Even if we sit there thinking we're going to be make more sales in the afternoon or whatever.
Yeah.
And I like that answer, and I think I'm not particularly an optimist or a pessimist in the sense, but I do think our culture is in a sense in a bit like a narcissistic style of personality. I think we're overinflated, and we'll start to come down to earth again, in a sense. And it's partly why I think people are interested in mindfulness and things like that, because I think there's an inner sense of us needing to come to earth and to ground again. Whether it'll need to get worse before it gets better, I mean, there's all of that is possible, but I think nature can be trusted in a sense to bring things back to reality.
That concept of it being subversive goes way back. It just reminds me of there's a story from about 400 years ago of the Zen monk Takuan Sohu, who I think he bested a highwayman who tried to rob him, and he beat him with his stick. And the highwayman wanted to learn his martial skills, so he said, okay, sit in my garden and do Zen meditation every day, and I'll tell you when you're ready to go on to the more advanced techniques. To put a long story short, 6 months later, I don't want to be a highwayman. I don't want to learn these martial techniques anymore. Yeah. I realized I've lived my life very wrong, and I'm going to make amends.
Nice. I hadn't heard that. That's great.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for that, Martin. Is any other thoughts before we conclude, or do you think?
No, that's fine. Thank you. Really
I'll
enjoyed
link to your website and work beneath in the comment section on whatever platform people listen to this on. And thank you very much.
Brilliant.
Chat again sometime. Thank you.
Nice to meet you.